Well, thank you everyone for coming to part 2 of our musing, thoughts and general argument between ourselves about homelessness. I'm Justin Bates and my co-presenter is Mark Prichard. And unlike yesterday, I am actually here. I am sorry about that. I managed to completely forget that I had to teach my son something in the morning. He grudgingly agreed to write a handful of letters and read one sentence to me. It was not the most successful of teaching mornings, but it would have been even less successful if I'd been trying to do it whilst presenting a webinar. Same as yesterday, reminder that we've got the general disclaimer. Please don't sue us if anything in here turns out to be wrong. This is still really Mark and I just talking about things that interest us, and we hope that you're getting some benefit out of it. As with yesterday, if you do questions in the chat box, we'll try and pick them up towards the end. We've ideally, assuming this runs to time, we've got probably 15-20 minutes for questions from yesterday and from today. And as we said in yesterday's webinar, we are going to try and deal with some of the broad themes that come out of the questions by way of an email after this, wrapping everything up. In terms of what we're picking up today, we've really got the last bits of the part 7 process to do. I want to talk a little bit about intentionality, notwithstanding Mark's poo-pooing of the fact that it'll have any relevance yesterday. Priority need is probably the biggest bit. And then I do think there's a small question in local connection that we need to talk about. Mark has then got things he wants to raise on the question of discharge, which I confess I don't really understand. So I'm going to let Mark run that bit by himself. And then we've got time for questions at the end. As I say, the best way to run questions, given the number of you that are in this, is if you can type questions into the chat box. That would be really, really helpful. So, look, intentionality. Same as yesterday, you guys don't really need a 5-minute seminar from me on what intentionality is. You know how this works. It's the deliberate act or failure to do an act, the consequence of which means that you lose accommodation which was available for your occupation, and then it would have been reasonable for you to continue to occupy. Now, Mark was poo-pooing this yesterday. So let me just explain where I think intentionality becomes relevant in the coronavirus context. And then Mark can tell me why I'm wrong. The first is, you are going to have people who made a conscious choice to leave accommodation because of fear about coronavirus. The obvious cases I would have thought are going to be people in shared accommodation where either one of their housemates has tested positive or their housemate behaves in a way that isn't consistent with social distancing. I mean, you might have seen in the press stories of people who invite strangers over for parties, who they don't clean the bathroom, etc. And I just pick up on that one because, of course, you all have picked up that cleaning the bathroom is the one that the non-statutory guidance focuses on as being particularly important. So if you left your accommodation because of the behaviour of others, are you intentionally homeless? And then the second one, the second issue, and I think this is probably the more difficult one, is what about the failure to pay rent? You've got, as you know, thousands of people at the moment who are who've either lost their income completely because of coronavirus, those who what are in colloquially termed the gig economy, or those whose incomes have dropped dramatically. Then if they're lucky, they've been furloughed. Now, at the moment, landlords can't bring possession proceedings, and they can't do that until the end of August. But eventually, but come the end of August, there will be possession claims. They just will. We all know this. If someone is evicted, whether under Section 21 or by Section 8 notices, for failure to pay their rent, are they intentionally homeless? And having poo-pooed this, I then talked to Mark about the Tower Hamlets case. Because, of course, that Tower Hamlets case, one of the interesting things that was in there was the IH claim was upheld by the Court of Appeal because the claimant, the applicant for assistance, hadn't approached the landlord about finding an alternative tenant. In simple terms, what had happened was she'd taken a property that was affordable when there were 2 of them. Then one of them leaves. And there's some evidence that the landlord might have been prepared to accept an alternative tenant to cover the share of the rent. and she doesn't do anything about it. Given that the non-statutory guidance says that tenants who are experiencing shortfalls with their rent and financial difficulties should be approaching their landlords, and landlords are encouraged to behave in a responsible and kind-hearted manner, is there an argument that someone who doesn't try and renegotiate the rent ends up being IH if they get evicted? Mark, you thought I was talking rubbish yesterday, so what did you say to these 2 points?
I wouldn't have gone so far as that, Justin. But
well, you did an email afterwards.
I think, first of all, we have to be quite clear about the Tower Hamlets case and what the facts were, and not kind of overreach, perhaps. As I understand it, reading the Housing Law report, the landlord, or the landlord's agent, can't remember which, I think it's the landlord's agent, went to one of the joint tenants who had, for the most part, paid her rent, and said, well, look, you know, we've got a problem here. She explained the problem to the agent, and the upshot of that was that there was actually an offer by the agents, by the landlord, to say, well, we can help you out here, you know, we can do something about this. And I think there were 3 possible ways canvassed in the Court of Appeal in which basically she could have carried on with somebody else. Obviously, there's a whole mechanics issue there of how the joint tenancy ends, but the Court of Appeal were convinced that, well, you know, if she had not just merely kind of refused that perspective of that offer, a perspective solution, she would not have, the local authority were quite entitled to say, well, that was, or whether it was an act or an omission, they didn't really care which, it was an act or omission for the purpose of Section 191. So I think the interesting thing about that case, first of all, is the facts that were before the court. The facts were actually, this wasn't just something that the tenant had not even considered. It was something that had kind of more or less been put to her by the landlord. Contrast that with a lot of cases that we're likely to see in the forthcoming months. Well, it won't necessarily be the case that the landlord has put that to the tenant, or one of a number of co-sharers. It might be something about which the tenant is actually ignorant. You know, that's an ignorance of a relevant fact, that the landlord would have been willing, but well, they had no reason to understand that this might be the case, that there was a solution out there. That's my first problem with that case. And I suppose, as always with intentionality, you know, you come across homeless decision makers that are very well versed in what they need to do to make that decision stack up. You get other homeless officers, whether it's, you know, through want of training or guidance, sort of don't really sort of box off all the 5 or 6 limbs of the test. And of course, you know, with coronavirus, we have a massive problem. I'm guessing that the reason I was kind of saying yesterday that intentionality might be a dead duck is because, well, it seems to me that for a lot of cases, councils might just not be in a position to box off all of those limbs of the test. Affordability, obviously, being the key one.
Okay, I get that, but let me push back on this on slightly on one point though. Why can't you, in your 189A assessment and plan, say that one of the steps that it's reasonable for the person who's threatened with homelessness, because they will be at this stage, because they've only had the notice seeking possession. Why can't you say that one of the steps that's reasonable for them to take is to approach the landlord and see if he'll negotiate a lower rent and refer him to the relevant guidance? I mean, shouldn't that be a standard line in a 189A assessment, given the guidance from the government?
Yes, and I think then you're potentially on much stronger ground as a local authority. You're quite right. You have that opportunity in the initial assessment to say, well, hang on, what is the problem here? What are the potential solutions? What do we advise you to do? I suppose, and that potentially addresses the problem, because I think my worry, if I was a homeless manager, is that you kind of circulate the Tower Hamlets case, and then officers just assume, oh, we've got a get out here. You've got to have the factual basis. My worry would be that you have decision makers assuming willy-nilly, well, oh, we can just assume that would have happened. I think you need a factual basis for that, and I think you're right. The initial Section 189A assessment and saying, well, this is what we would expect you to do, you're kind of then laying the groundwork.
Okay. What about the first one? What about people who leave property that is objectively suitable because of a fear about coronavirus, or because of a fear about coronavirus arising from the behaviour of others in the property? Does that worry you at all? See any problems there?
I think, as ever with homelessness, you've got the possibility for a whole range of factual scenarios. And it seems to me, when we're starting to think about this, I kind of think, well, surely there's a range. There's a kind of, at one extreme, people have left where actually they haven't even spoken to their co-sharers and said, well, hang on a minute, you shouldn't actually be doing this in the communal area, or you should be cleaning the communal toilet after, and actually haven't raised it. It's something that a reasonable person could have addressed, but they failed to do so. To the other extreme, where, well, you've got somebody with a serious underlying condition, they're simply not able to shield themselves because of the setup. Perhaps it's a bed sit, and they're having to share with other people who aren't isolating with them. They're going out and partying and then coming back. There's a range, isn't there? And again, isn't that a factual question for the council to determine?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these will end up being factual questions, and I suspect to end this note end this bit on a point of agreement. I suspect your first point is right, which is that for a number of authorities, the scale of the response to the pandemic means they may not be in a position to do a full intentionality assessment, and so effectively benefit of the doubt is going to go in favour of the homeless person each time. But there will be some. And I think there's more in that Tower Hamlets case than might first appear to be the case. Let's have a bit of a talk about priority need as well, because here, I'd be interested to know if you agree with me on this. Here, I think the government is doing a really bad disservice to local authorities in England when you contrast that with what the Welsh government have done for authorities in Wales. It seems to me there's two possible routes into priority need arising as a result of the pandemic. The first is, will we actually finally get some vaguely up-to-date case law about what an emergency means, rather than the old ones, or that slightly weird one that's slightly more recent, where someone's caravan just vanishes and no one knows where it's got to. I mean, potentially, on the face of the wording, you would have thought that the pandemic could amount to an emergency, wouldn't you? I mean, we'll look at it a bit later on, but it's certainly, on the face of it, appears to be an emergency. Perhaps the more obvious one, though, is how the pandemic impacts on vulnerability as a result, in particular, of any other special reason. Old age, potentially any of them, I suppose, old age, mental physical disabilities, or any other special reason. You can immediately see how the pandemic is going to impact on the question of priority need. And I think there's a couple of interesting questions in here. The first is, how is the test going to work in these current unusual circumstances? significantly more vulnerable than the ordinary person, do you take into account, now the ordinary person has to be assumed to be hale and hearty, but do you take into account the effect of homelessness in a pandemic, or do you simply limit it to the effect of homelessness when deciding whether or not someone is in priority need? That's the first thing I'm sort of interested in thinking about. So here it is, the comparator type. And then secondly, I'd be interested in your thoughts on, does the Welsh position have any relevance for what's going on in England? Because the Welsh have said that it's a grave and exceptional risk. They've answered my first concern by saying that you do have to ignore, you're not allowed to say that it's the ordinary homeless person in the time of coronavirus as your comparator. It's the ordinary homeless person. And they've effectively said, seems to me, that anyone who is street homeless is automatically going to be in a less advantageous position than the ordinary homeless person because of the effects of coronavirus. So it seems to me that what the Welsh have done is said that everyone who is street homeless, at least, is in priority need because of the pandemic. Is that your reading of it? And what do you think the position is for England?
I think you're right in that there's an obvious question that arises. Who is the comparator? Who are we comparing the homeless person with? Now, we'll all probably be familiar with the Hotak case. And it seems to me the Hotak case, a lot of the dicta in the Hotak case was really about saying, well, this has to be viewed objectively. And that included the idea that it wasn't even the ordinary homeless person in the borough, in the district of the council. I think I'm right in saying that there's a statement in Hotak which says, well, this is generally not locally. And that seems to me to reinforce this idea that it's objective. And my concern for local authorities, if I was advising them, would be, well, if you start trying to change the comparator from what it's understood, you're really kind of opening up Pandora's box there and an avenue for the applicant to challenge you. Might it be one of those situations where it's easier for the local authority effectively to play with a straight bat and to assume that it is an ordinary homeless person that doesn't have to deal with these problems posed by the virus?
Yeah, I agree that's easier because that's a lower test to meet. But do you think it's right? I mean, look, the easiest thing to do on any homelessness application is just to say, I accept you meet every condition. Because apart from eligibility, there's always an element of judgment, of discretion isn't the right word, but there's an element of evaluation in there. I mean, you can always make a homelessness application go away by just agreeing. But do you think that's right though, conceptually?
I genuinely don't know which way the courts would jump on this.
Yeah, again, that's not the question. What do you think?
I think it should be we should retain the objective, the person who doesn't have to deal with the pandemic. Having said that, I also wonder about, well, the element of the risk.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the risk element.
That the person will, on the balance of probability, suffer, I think probably is a very different, potentially a different question at the end of June, when our understanding is, hang on, like the Welsh Guidance says, this is a grave and exceptional risk as far as we are aware, to a few months down the line. And also, I think there is an element of judgment here, because if you are a healthy person, you don't have any underlying conditions, it might well be, particularly a few months down the line, that, well, actually, the likelihood of you suffering harm, you know, you can make that decision stack up. You can give reasons why that person will not, in all likelihood, suffer harm.
But that's not consistent with the Welsh guidance. That's not the position the Welsh have taken. Almost inevitable that a person who is street homeless, less able than an ordinary person to suffer. So the Welsh seem to be saying that the existence of the virus means that if you are street homeless, regardless of your underlying health, you are more at risk. Now, obviously, it's the Welsh guidance, so it doesn't bind anyone in England. I mean, it does give rise to the potential to apply to a Welsh authority and then get referred back under the local connection provisions, with the more generous approach that's taken in Wales. But I mean, how would you do it as an authority? Because the attraction of the Welsh approach, it seems to me, is it's simple. It doesn't actually require anyone to make any assessment of the health risks posed by coronavirus, and it doesn't require you to do any kind of analysis of how bad it is in your borough or in the surrounding boroughs. It just says, look, this is an unusual public health disease, and so blanket, more generous approach. I mean, how do you see this actually being done in practice?
Well, yeah, but I think the point that we haven't made also in relation to the Welsh guidance is that at first blush it's a blanket approach, but then remember that the test in Wales is different. They have codified the Pereira test, and if you read the Welsh guidance, they are talking about people at risk of rough sleeping.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't a seminar to be rude about the Welsh Assembly, although we could, but they've made a complete mess of priority need. Because in the Housing Wales Act, they've codified Pereira or some small variant of it, and then in their guidance, they say apply HOTAC. So, I mean, priority need in Wales is its own special circle of hell for the mess they've made of it. But just conceptually, they've taken a really simple approach. And I find it slightly distasteful that the Secretary of State hasn't done something similar here, because it means that you're asking individual officers to make decisions about something they're plainly not qualified to make assessments of.
Yes, and let's be frank, you know, hopefully, I mean, clearly that the message from the government is two-pronged. I wouldn't go so far myself as to say disingenuous, but it's two-pronged. It's on the one hand, well, let's help everybody in settled accommodation. But the question remains. I do think that the passage of time and what we learn about the virus and the particular risk, the people that are particular risk, is potentially significant here. There will be cases where, well, okay, we've accommodated them initially, but it's going to be several months down the line before we sort out, well, who have we got left that we haven't been able to house? Which cases are we going to have to make a Section 184 decision on? What is the position going to be at that point? Because remember, it's whether they're vulnerable at that point, not when they originally walked through the door.
No, quite. I mean, last question, last sort of point back from me on this slide, because I don't want to foreshadow too much where I'm going to go with the local connection questions. The problem I have with what you said about the position down the line is, as best as we can tell, there's going to be a second wave, but it will probably be regional. And you'll have outbreaks flaring up in individual places. I mean, that seems to be what's happening in China, happening in Germany, and happening to some extent in Italy. Which means that not only are authorities going to have to make decisions up to date by reference to decision of data review, etc., in the usual way, but they're going to have to keep themselves informed about what the position in their own local area as regards the extent of the second wave, or the position nationally in the extent of the second wave? Or do you think I'm just overcomplicating it, which is entirely possible?
No, I mean, these are the questions that if I was a decision maker, I'd be scratching my head over. I think there might be a difference locally versus nationally between the risk to the applicants, but we've got, in terms of the comparator, we've got authority from HOTAC saying, well, this is nationally, you know, it's the homeless person nationally. But then again, we go back to the same question. Well, is this an ordinary homeless person in the pandemic, or an ordinary homeless person per se? I'd probably, if I was pushed, I'd think the latter.
What about any 189D, 1D arguments? I mean, can you see, how do you see arguments about priority need by virtue of an emergency playing out?
Well, again, the advice has to be get a housing solicitor, doesn't it? Because you've got a potentially you've got a three-pronged attack as an applicant. You should be putting information before the council which relates to the medical or physical condition, if any you've got, special reason, the pandemic being a special reason, and then we've got subsection 1D, which normally we don't even think about. But the pandemic, surely, I mean, that's a kind of paradigm example of an emergency per se. Reading the old case law, it says we had a few cases, and they are very old cases. And I'll say a little bit about that in a moment, but we've got Noble and Braddock. They basically said, I think basically Noble was approving Braddock, or one was approving the other. They say a few interesting things about this category. One is that it must be both an emergency and a disaster. And the disaster has to be similar, according to Noble, to fire or flood. It's kind of, another disaster is of the type of. And then you have this kind of dicta in Noble, which says, well, it must consist of something which causes physical damage, causing the accommodation to be uninhabitable. That is essentially what a disaster of a similar kind to flood and fire mean. Now, I suppose the big question I have there is, well, if it gets back to the Court of Appeal, won't they just say, well, they didn't actually consider a pandemic in Braddock and Noble. This wasn't brought to their attention. They didn't consider it. We can depart from that. But if I was an applicant,
I have to say that's my assumption, by the way.
yeah.
That you'd get back in front of a judge, and the judge would say, I'm not interested in cases about one-off emergency events. That's just the court explaining how those facts amounted to an emergency or didn't. I mean, there's nothing to compare this to. I mean, we haven't had a pandemic since the 77 Act. I mean, there is one interesting question, and I've cut you off, so I just want to just leave this here. There is one interesting question. During the regular winter flu seasons, does anybody ever try and argue that someone's in priority need because of the impact of the flu on them? I mean, I've never come across cases like that, but I mean, a virulent winter flu could kill people. Anyway, I interrupted you. It wasn't really a question for you to answer, because I don't think there is a case on it. But sorry, you were saying.
No, I've never come across a case personally where that's been argued. If I was an applicant solicitor, I'd be going all guns blazing. Well, this is a paradigm example of an emergency. You can't say it's an emergency. The old case law shouldn't be followed because they didn't consider a pandemic. It wasn't argued before the court. The question then becomes, have they become homeless because of? There is a causal element here. It's not merely that there's an emergency, it's you have become homeless as a result of. And it seems to me that you'll have two kind of categories of case here, and including some applicants, there'll be one tranche of applicants where, yes, they became homeless, and it presumably the meaning of homelessness here must follow the statutory definition. It's not merely that you don't have accommodation which you have a legal right to occupy. Surely it must be, given that homelessness is defined on the face of the Act, it must be, well, you're homeless because of any of the statutory reasons, including it's no longer reasonable to continue to occupy. You know, I wasn't able to stay there because of my particular health condition, and the other people were not allowing me to share.
Yeah, I agree. I think the causal bit is the more important bit there, and that's where I can see there being scope for legitimate disagreement. I would not fancy being the local authority that goes to the Court of Appeal to argue this isn't an emergency. I do not think that is an argument that is likely to be attractive to lots of judges out there.
And I think also there's a danger for councils. If I was a homeless manager, I'd be kind of just flagging this up. You know, if we are going to have to make at some point prior to any decisions, hang on, guys. It's not just ill health. It's not just mental or physical illness, disability, special reason. You've got to consider this.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I mean, the paragraph about it hasn't changed in 6 editions because there's been no case law on it. So I think it's worth reminding everyone that it still exists, and it's one that is going to have to be considered in some of the cases. Can I just then turn to a concern I have on local connection? It's a very short concern, and you were kind enough not to rubbish this when I raised it with you yesterday in our chat. Isn't there an issue that because local connection referrals are discretionary, authorities who are looking at doing a referral, particularly during the second wave and when this becomes a much more regional problem, aren't they going to have to update themselves on the state of the virus and the support available in the authority to whom they want to refer the person? Or again, is this just me being overly complicated, do you think?
I think it's always worth, when I'm advising, training people in local authorities, it's always worth thinking about the pitfalls, and you've identified a particular pitfall. It's often forgotten, of course, that it's not a duty to refer. It's a power to refer. I'm one of those kind of people that kind of distributes kind of template letters, and lawyers on the other side must think, oh my God, template letters, they're evil. But, one of the things I make sure that's in that particular letter is, before we've actually gone on to consider, well, have you got a connection here? Have you got a connection there? Is it safe for you to go back there? You address specifically, and it might only be a paragraph, but you address specifically, well, we have considered as a preliminary issue whether it is an appropriate case to exercise that power. I think it's quite possible, if we go into that regional scenario, if there's a particular risk in that borough, particularly if the applicant is at particular risk because of their age, their medical conditions, that might be something you want to deal with briefly in that letter, just to stop that challenge. Although, as with all these things, really, it depends upon whether the homeless person is wise enough to get a lawyer.
But it's not just age and medical conditions, is it? I mean, again, from what we know of the virus at the moment, it has a disproportionate impact on BAME people. So isn't it something that if you're thinking about making a local connection referral to someone who's BAME, shouldn't you always have to take into account the state of the pandemic in the area to which they want to refer them to? Because failure to do so could itself be a breach of the Equality Act.
It could be a breach of the Equality Act. It also could be failure to have, more fundamentally in public law, failure to have regard to relevant consideration.
Yeah. I mean, just traditional JR. But I think this is actually a lot more difficult. In a handful of cases, hopefully, I think this will actually be a really difficult question, and it will change over time as to when it is considered quote unquote safe to send someone back to a particular area. I think this is one that will end up generating a lot of paperwork.
And I think the main thing for decision makers is to kind of make sure you've considered it, not worry too much about giving very lengthy reasons, but just collecting the basic facts and addressing your mind to it. I mean, you're not going to know, you haven't got a crystal ball, you don't know, whether that is likely to impact upon that particular individual. But merely just demonstrating that you've collected the basic facts, you've considered it, is the referral appropriate given that factual matrix?
You wanted to talk about discharge stuff, and as you've been poo-pooing all of my ideas so far, I poo-pooed this when you raised it, when you posed it with me. Well, every time you and I have been prepping this, every time I raise something I think is interesting, you go, yeah, not really, Justin. So this is your baby, and I didn't think it was very interesting when you raised it yesterday. So I'm just going to be quiet and let you deal with this bit.
I'm not sure. See, Justin's picked me up there. You see how sneaky he is. I'm not sure it's very interesting. I just thought that even though we've gone through the classic sort of statutory limbs to getting the main duty, eligibility, homelessness, priority need, and so on, I just thought it was worth flagging up issues around the initial assessment. I might be wrong here. Our friends in local government might just have they've got this cracked. They've got it all sorted, not a problem. But I just have in mind that in some local authorities, they might be playing catch up with the paperwork, and I just think care needs to be taken there. In particular, for instance, if we're dealing with them under Part 7, we accept that somebody is homeless, they're in the relief duty. We just need to make sure that we have actually carried out the initial assessment, the Section 189A assessment and plan, and critically that we've notified them of the outcome of the assessment and the plan. And the reason I say that is because performing the relief duty, and again, there's not much case law yet on the Homelessness Reduction Act amendments, but it's on the face of the Act that when you're performing the relief duty, what do you have to do? You have to take reasonable steps for the purpose of helping the applicants try to find a suitable accommodation that will last for 6 months, basically. But in deciding what those reasonable steps are, you have to have regard to how you've assessed the person, and the assessment, of course, once you're satisfied as to eligibility and either threatened homelessness or homelessness, relates to 3 items. You have to assess the reason why they've become homeless or threatened with homelessness, what type of housing they need, and whether they need any support. I mean, this is really a very useful mechanism in the context of the pandemic, because you will have some people that actually have been homeless for a long time. They need support in order to go on and obtain and retain settled accommodation. But we just need to make sure as councils that we've actually notified that assessment without making a decision on what type of housing they need and whether they need support. You're not really in a position rationally, or at least lawfully under the Act, to decide what the reasonable steps are. And in a situation where you've kind of perhaps got cases where not everything has been documented, we were in a big rush at the end of March, I think, that's just worth flagging up. So if I was a homeless manager or a supervisor, perhaps I'd be going around and just checking the cases. Have we got that paperwork out? Because it might become an area on which you can be challenged come the end of the relief duty. You don't want to get to what you think is the end of the relief duty and say, well, you haven't got to first base here.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, you're right. That wasn't very interesting. Sorry, I couldn't resist that. Let's pick up a few questions then. Let me see. We've got some questions that have come in the chat box. Can you see those, Mark, or do you want me to just read them out to you?
No, I don't think I can.
Right. So, sure. We'll do these ones from today, then we'll pick up the ones from tomorrow if there's any time left at the end. Surely, if the ordinary person has the security of private property to reside in as opposed to street homelessness, and therefore automatically exposed to COVID-19 at all times, I agree with the Welsh position. Well, that's a question of what's the ordinary person, isn't it? It's not the ordinary person, it's the ordinary person when homeless. So your comparator isn't the ordinary person who's housed, it's the ordinary person who is homeless. So that's the comparator you have to make, or am I missing something with that question? Mark?
I'm not sure I understood the question, sorry.
Okay. Have a look at anything else that's come in. Does Luke Hall's Everyone In letter create the legislative intention of guidance? It has not yet been superseded by any other form of official letter. What do you think? We touched on this yesterday.
I think certainly if you're an applicant solicitor, it's something worth arguing, but I don't know. It's kind of a strange letter, isn't it? The law hasn't changed. There's nothing to state. There's nothing to indicate it is statutory guidance. It is issued under the statute.
It is not statutory guidance. I mean, the one thing it can't be is legislative intention, because Parliament hasn't written it, and Parliament hasn't approved the Code of Guidance or any other statutory guidance that the Secretary of State is entitled to issue. It is the Minister's view. I mean, you give it, it seems to me, you give it appropriate weight, and that's likely to be a fairly significant weight at the moment. But it's only non-statutory guidance. It's one of the things that, frankly, I think, and I may have said earlier today, that I think the government deserves brickbats being thrown at it for. So much of this could and should have been done by statutory guidance, like the Welsh, because then things become a lot easier. Uploading things onto websites a couple of days after you send them to people is not an appropriate way to carry out government and to issue advice during a pandemic. I mean, the Welsh managed to get their guidance done by April. Why couldn't we have done something similar? I don't see how it can create any kind of public law duty to house someone, because it isn't statutory guidance. It's not something that's designed to benefit any particular individual. And frankly, as we talked about yesterday, it's quite hard to understand what power Luke Hall thinks everyone's acting under. Because if they're not eligible, this can't be a Part 7 issue. I mean, if you're being charitable, Luke Hall's letter falls into the category of common sense, not law. And the problem is law and common sense don't always coincide. I wish they would just issue statutory guidance, would be my view on it. What else have we got? As regards priority need, are you able to assume that circumstances will return to semi-normal at some stage while recognising the current exceptional circumstances? Mark, what do you think?
I think possibly they're alluding here to that kind of difference over time, aren't they? But as you quite rightly said, well, the pandemic is still in effect. There will be a second wave. I mean, if there are homeless officers, I mean, I'm sure there are homeless officers out there that will want to find people of non-priority need, even though the aim has to be to try and house people. I think the argument is more likely to be about, well, is this particular person, given their particular situation, vulnerable, rather than relying on, well, the pandemic's gone away yet. I can't see that we're going to be in that position soon.
Yeah, I mean, it's priority need as at the date of the decision, whether the original decision or the review, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So, at the date of the decision, are you in priority need? Part of that assessment must be looking at how your personal circumstances interact with the wider pandemic situation. If it only becomes difficult, doesn't it, if you think if the decision maker thinks that the pandemic has either passed or has become so mitigated as to no longer amount to an immediate threat, but recognises that there's a possibility of that happening in the future. And I don't see how you've got the evidence to come to that first conclusion yet. I mean, there's nothing I'm aware of in terms of the public health guidance that suggests this is still anything other than a national pandemic. And whilst we're beginning to ease our lockdown restrictions, you know, we still don't have, to put it, I mean, to give you an example, it's a criminal offence to travel on public transport without covering your face with a face mask. That would suggest to me we still have a pretty big problem with a pandemic in this country. I think you've got to assume, well, the safest course of action is to assume that the pandemic is still in effect and is still posing a very real threat to people, particularly when they are street homeless. Or would you disagree with that?
No, I think I agree.
Right, that clearly people have disagreed with that because a lot of questions just popped up. So let's just have a look. Could the Section 179 duty be stretched to encompass how homeless, non-eligible people were accommodated? What do you think, Mark?
Section 179.
Yeah,
that's the general. That's the general duty to have an advice service, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the. I'm going to say that is duty of local authority to provide advisory services. You must provide or secure the provision of a service for providing information and advice on preventing homelessness, securing accommodation, and the rights of people.
We're doing more than providing information and advice. We're securing accommodation for them.
Yeah, I think that's a stretch. 179 is clearly not intended to provide accommodation, because 179 is effectively a structural level obligation on the local authority to make sure that advice exists for everyone, rather than to help any particular person. I don't think 179 is your friend there for trying to create a housing duty. I would struggle with that. I think accommodating after making a not in priority need decision would look like the local authority is acting in bad faith. Because if you're not at risk, why continue to accommodate them? It seems like a contradiction to me.
Are we just back there to kind of, well, you have a discretion?
Yeah, I mean, you can accommodate someone who's not in priority need. They're not owed the full 1932 duty, but you can accommodate them for a period. I know that in practice, once you've decided not in priority need, you tend to give a relatively short period to leave. But how long that period is a matter for your discretion in each individual case. And you might decide, in the current circumstances, to give a relatively generous period before they have to leave, precisely because, although they're not currently in priority need, if they go out and catch it, they will be in priority need, and so it won't achieve very much. I think that'd be my answer on that one. Someone asked, could we be guided by the COVID-19 alert level? It's still gone down, but it's gone down to level 3, but level 3 means it's still in general circulation. I mean, I would have thought the COVID-19 alert level is part of the factual matrix of things you have to take into account, but it can't be the only thing, it seems to me. Because the COVID-19 alert level is a national level, and there might be something that makes it more or potentially less significant in your area. So I don't know if anybody else is following this.
Or for that particular person. Yeah.
Or for that particular person.
And the danger is that that officers who haven't thought through what their reasoning is says, well, that means there isn't a risk anymore. And that's the difficulty, that you deal with the evidence irrationally.
Exactly. I mean, there's an interesting one going on at the moment. Sorry to make this all about Wales, but in Anglesey, it does look like Anglesey has got an unexpected and quite virulent second outbreak. So much so that the Welsh ministers are wondering about imposing a very strict lockdown just on Anglesey. So if you were the local authority decision maker in Anglesey and you said, oh, well, nationally it's gone down to level 3, I think you might be in some difficulties because you appear to be plague central at the moment. And the evidence is quite compelling that you're plague central. Oh, here's a good one. Where the duty was discharged prior to the pandemic and there have been no changes in circumstances, are you able to treat the pandemic as a material change? That's a good question. What do you think, Mark?
I would be minded to say yes, but I'll go back to Fahir Enrica Begum. Does it have to be a change in the applicant's circumstances? Well, the applicant's circumstances, wouldn't they incorporate the situation in which they're living? It's not merely just a physical attribute of theirs. Does it incorporate their situation? Isn't that part of the factual matrix?
Yeah, I think I would tend to agree. Certainly, if that's a line you went down as a local authority, you'd need to make that decision knowing full well that you're inviting a judicial review. I'm not sure I fancy defending that as a judicial review. I mean, I will do if you pay me because that's my job, but my instinct is a court is going to say that's sufficient. I mean, given how generous the case law is and what change of circumstance means, I think that's probably the better view. Is a change of circumstance.
I think that those change of circumstances judicial review are, they're always a way of burning a couple of grand of your homelessness budget, aren't they, rather than just conceding points generally. Yeah,
I mean, they're one of those situations where the housing officer and the housing manager has clearly decided that they have a concern for the financial well-being of lawyers, and they've decided that the money should be spent on ensuring that lawyers have enough money rather than anything else. Here's a good question as well. Probably one for you, more for you, Mark. How long should the local authority take to notify rough sleepers they've been housed at the relief duty stage?
Well, housed at the relief duty stage, I'm not sure I like the way in which the question has been posited, simply because, being a pedant, I like to kind of always say, well, the relief duty and the interim duty are two different duties.
There you go. So our questioner has immediately corrected it. Sorry, have a relief duty. I think, Mark, you're mean picking up on that, given that people are just typing this into a chat box. We know what they mean.
Okay, so notifying them that they are in relief. There will be a delay sometimes. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Councils are overstretched. There will be a delay sometimes between you being satisfied, actually coming to be satisfied they're homeless and eligible, and notifying them. However, there's a difference between a delay for a period with a reasonable excuse and a delay of 2, 3, 4 months. There's nothing stopping you as a local authority going round and checking, well, have we actually told these people the basis upon which we're housing them? Have we told them, have we assessed them? Have we told them the outcome of that assessment? We will have to really try and figure out what their circumstances are, and if are they a kind of a rough sleeper? Why have they become homeless? Why did we accommodate them? I think there will come a time, surely, where your delay no longer is reasonable. But that's a matter of fact and degree, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I would have thought, I think you're right. The reality is at the moment, people are stretched, things are a bit fraught still, and some slippage is not going to be too big a deal. The important thing, I think, is as conditions begin to improve, you need to do what you've been going on about, Mark. You need to go on about basically go back and look at your files and check the paperwork, and then get yourself to the stage where everything that should have been issued has been issued. I think that would be my answer to it. I mean,
and it goes back
it ties back in, though, doesn't it? In practical terms, it's going to tie back into that Mitchell case from a couple of weeks ago, the Islington one. Because if you've given them relief duty accommodation and 188 has been triggered, you aren't going to be able to end the 188. If you subsequently decide no priority need, you aren't going to be able to end the 188 accommodation anyway until you've done the letter that complies with 1881ZA. So, I mean, you're going to have to get your paperwork in order anyway.
It's in your interest to do so, to go around and actually just, do an audit, a quick audit of your files.
Yeah. We have 1 minute or so left. So if there are any last questions to come in, I see there's been a couple, but for example, the one about what's the case law for emergency fire, flood or other disaster, I'll email that round later because that's an easy one to do. Some local authorities have not provided a Reduction Act personal housing plan or assessment. Returns to yesterday's question, was the application taken? Is it automatic or not? I don't know. I mean, we spent a long time talking about it yesterday because I think the application, whether an application has been taken or not, is a really important question. I think this is, for the first time, I think it's something that's actually going to end up being litigated as opposed to being something that's ancillary to the second half of the question. So application, I'm reason to believe, etc., etc. I think it's really difficult to identify when an application has been made. Application taken is the wrong question. Application made is the important bit. And I wouldn't be surprised, for all the reasons we talked about yesterday, if that doesn't end up being litigated. Right. I think, Mark, anything you want to add on finally?
Nothing that springs to mind, no. I suppose the only other question I had really was, are there issues around suitability that we've missed out? Is that, or really kind of, is that a bit of a dead duck for the world because authorities are doing the best they can and a court isn't going to order a local authority to do something which they simply can't do?
Well, there's only been that one case, hasn't there, that permissioned, that JR that we were talking about last night, where someone was offered temporary accommodation and they turned it down on the grounds that it didn't have its own microwave, and the although there was a fridge, they'd have to disinfect it themselves because it had been taken from somewhere else. Yeah, and that unsurprisingly was a failed suitability challenge in the High Court. It was, if I may respectfully suggest so, perhaps not the best case, not the best facts to try and push forward on a suitability challenge. There might be some suitability stuff. I mean, you could imagine someone with a very compromised immune system being offered accommodation in an HMO or something like that. My instinct is, at the moment at least, you'd need quite a clear case for it to be worth bringing a challenge. I don't get the impression the High Court are looking to create more problems for local authorities at the moment. In 6 months' time, if things have improved, maybe they'll be a bit more interventionist. But I think at the moment, you'd need a really clear case. And you know, in 2 months' time, if this is still going on, I can do another one just on suitability. Right. Everyone, thank you very much. That's been incredibly useful. I hope you've all enjoyed that and found it helpful. What we will do is pull together any questions that we haven't answered today and some questions from yesterday. And over the next, give us about a week to do it. Mark and I will put together a small, please don't sue us, here are our thoughts briefing note, and we will send that round to everyone who's signed up for these. Both these webinars and the slides are online, and again, we'll get the link sent out to you in due course, so you can watch this in the I would say whilst you're at home, but of course, given most of you are working at home anyway, the difference between work and home isn't really that great these days. Thank you very much. Questions have been really helpful. I've enjoyed that a lot, and we will send things out to you sometime in the next week, I would have thought. Thank you very much.